At one time abundant in England's crystal-clear chalk-fed rivers, there is a rare subspecies of Atlantic salmon that now teeters on the edge of extinction. The chalk stream salmon, the last king of Wessex, is one of the rarest fish on Earth, and yet, after 2 million years of holding fast right here on the south coast of England, they are now at 1 minute to midnight. There are a myriad of pressures and problems that are pushing them to the brink, but there is also urgent work underway to help bring them back. And Charles Rangeley-Wilson, the acclaimed angling writer and river conservationist, joins me to share his love of the chalk stream salmon, its colourful history as perhaps England's oldest indigenous species, and the plans afoot to save it. Project White Hart, a critical mission to save this incredible wild animal, is perhaps our last great hope to rekindle one of the most unique of all salmon runs that has helped shape our culture, our landscape, and imagination for centuries.
The chalk streams, from a fishing point of view, really became famous in the 19th century with the likes of Frederick Halford and skews and the whole dry fly innovation. And they became renowned as dry fly fisheries for trout. There were salmon fisheries on the chalk streams, but they maybe have been more important as a fishery, as a fishery for catching fish for the table, the royalty fishery, Woodmill Pool, that kind of thing. So I think that the trout fishing, the quality of the trout fishing has somewhat eclipsed the salmon. And of course, people would famously fish the chalk streams for mayfly and then head north for their salmon angling in the summer.
We have sparse evidence, don't we? I know you and I have been sharing photographs of salmon anglers from years gone by on the Itchen and the Test in particular. Do you think that salmon angling was a recreational endeavour on these chalk streams, or do you think it was, as you have just alluded, just for harvesting, just for the table?
Oh, well, no. It was definitely a recreational endeavour. I mean, there are some there are some anecdotes and famous stories about salmon anglers in the past. My first job after university was teaching at a place called Camford School in Dorset on the River Stour, which is it's not quite a chalk stream. It's a bit like a chalk stream in summer, and it's got a number of chalk stream tributaries. And the Stour was once very, very famous for its big salmon, and for the salmon fishery at Throop. And I know on the Froome, so I sort of tend to know the Dorset chalk streams better because I spent so much time working down there. But on the Froome, there were some real characters. There was a sort of Major Radcliffe who lived at Hyde House at the turn of the century. And if you go to Dorchester Museum, you'll actually find not a salmon, but another even rarer migratory fish, a massive sturgeon in Dorchester Museum, which Major Radcliffe caught. Now, to say he caught it, and he was a famous salmon angler, so he caught a lot of salmon on the Froome. To say he caught this fish was maybe a polite way of describing how, in fact, it met its demise, because when he heard that it was in the river, he did what every thinking gent did back in 1911 or whenever it was, and he reached for his shotgun. And he he went down to the pool and gave this rare sighting both barrels, and it tore off and it disappeared for a few days, but then he got told about it in another part of the river. And so he rigged up a kind of snagging system. And that's how he finally caught this sturgeon, sent it to the king. The king sent it back saying, thanks very much, but you can keep it. And it's now in Dorchester Museum. But Major Radcliffe saying, so there's the sort of, the breed of salmon angler back in the day. These rivers were well known for their salmon fishing. But I think probably the Avon and the Stour and the Froome might have been the more renowned for salmon fishing, angling, perhaps the Test and Itchen. I might be wrong, but I know that also rivers like the Avon and the Royalty Fishery were really, really renowned for their net fishing. And the size of the salmon that used to come out of the Royalty is absolutely incredible.
In my local pub, actually, I live, as you know, on the Upper Itchen, and in my local pub, The Bush, it's one of those glass box fish pubs. And there is a huge, grotesque, really, model plaster head of a giant salmon that claims to be 50 pounds and caught in 1850 something. it's probably true. I mean, they must
Yeah.
have been catching 50-pound fish down on the south chalk stream, 50-pound chalk stream salmon down on the south coast 200 years ago, right?
Definitely. So I know the royalty. I know that 50-pound salmon, there are several that were netted. I think it's called the Run or something like that at royalty. And I know Mudderford, that's right. And I know there was a 53-pound fish and a 52, all around that epic period of gigantic salmon at the early 20th century, which we'll get onto because the North Atlantic was cold then. So these fish were coming in at that size.
If we know that there was salmon angling on these rivers and there was a reason for anglers to come and prize their quarry down here, why do the likes of Halford and Skews, why do they never write about salmon angling? Why is it always upstream dry fly fishing for brown trout?
But I think Skews and Halford were pretty taken with the whole dry fly revolution. Well, Halford, obviously, because Skews then innovated and brought about the heathen nymph fishing. So they were very, very interested. And actually, to the point where salmon I think there was a period of time in the sort of late 19th, maybe early 20th century, where salmon was somewhat regarded as vermin.
Silver rats.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a thing. So, it's like so revered was the trout fishing and the dry fly fishing for trout that salmon were a nuisance and people didn't really want them around sort of, eating all the food.
It's interesting. And if we bring it up to the present day, you were talking just then about how the Atlantic it seems significantly colder, certainly colder enough to entice these bigger salmon.
Mm.
We now know that the seas are warmer 150, 200 years later. Is that, do you think, one of the main reasons why we're not getting these bigger fish back to these chalk streams down here on the south coast in Wessex?
I think the temperature of the North Atlantic, now you'd need someone like Ken, who I know you've interviewed before, Ken Whelan, would be much better on this, but there's definitely a relationship between the size of fish, the size of salmon, and of course the North Atlantic's got a number of temperature cycles. So there are natural temperature cycles in the North Atlantic. There's something that's actually called the North Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, something like that. And I think that operates on a sort of time span of sort of 25, 30 years, where it goes into naturally colder, naturally warmer phases. But then on top of that, you've got the fact that it's generally warming. So, for example, the 1970s were quite cold up until about late 1980s. But the cold, that was part of the multi-decadal oscillation. So it went into a cold phase. But the dip of that coldness was actually still the same temperature as the 19th century warm phase. So it's progressively getting warmer, and then you get these dips. And there's absolutely a relationship around the late 19th century, early 20th, when, not just on the Avon, but on rivers like the Herefordshire Wye, where you're getting really, really big salmon, and through to about the late 1930s or mid 1930s, I think. And then it went into a slightly warmer phase. And in the warmer phases, you tend to get more fish, but they're more the summer and autumn grilse. And why, I don't know, but speculating, or maybe I've read this, but I think that in the colder phases, the band at which all the food, the rich band, it's a sort of it's an area of the North Atlantic where the cold water is sinking, and then that brings up really nutrient-rich water from the bed of the sea, and that feeds basically the food chain. That moves further south. So I think the feeding conditions are much better in the colder periods, and then you get the multi-sea winter fish getting really quite large. Why it then switches in the warmer periods to grilse that spend only one summer at sea, I don't exactly know, but there is a relationship for sure.
That's fascinating. Of course, that's the big missing piece of the puzzle, isn't it? What's going on out at sea?
Yeah.
So let's bring it back to freshwaters. You wrote an article I think is absolutely fabulous. I think it was in the Field, and it is called England's or Let's Save England's White Rhino. And in that article, you go into some detail about the provenance and the history of the chalk streams and the chalk stream salmon. found that story utterly, that hypothesis that you and I have since spoken about at length, utterly fascinating. Could you share for our listeners a little bit about your theories about the history of chalk streams and where the salmon fits within that provenance?
Okay, so back in 2015 or so, I did a fantastic amount of reading because I was writing a book called Silver Shoals, which was about the relationship between a number of iconic species of fish and sort of British history. So diverting just very briefly, but it's fascinating. You know, if you look at the story of cod, for example, it leads you down some very, very interesting historical avenues. Like we probably won the Armada because of our cod fishery. In fact, Britain kept its cod fleet going precisely because it was anticipating a sort of naval conflict with Spain. And the cod fishermen were incredibly good mariners. They stayed at home that year. The first Icelandic cod war was actually a Middle Ages war when we were, arguing with the Icelanders over cod fishing rights. So anyway, I did the same level of research over salmon, and I became really interested in the work because I went over to Wales to meet the late great Steve Marsh-Smith, who did a fantastic amount for salmon on the Herefordshire Wye. I got interested in the writings of a chap called Hutton, who was looking at the sort of ebbs and flows of the fortunes of the salmon in the Herefordshire Wye. And he speculated way before science confirmed that there were sort of, in a way, two sort of races of salmon, or two large genetic groups. One would be the northeast salmon, from the Tyne and Tweed and so on, and the other would be the southwest salmon. So that would include chalk streams, but also Devon and Cornwall, Spain, Ireland, etc. And the reason why he speculated this is he put loads and loads of fishery returns together, and he from all over the British Isles, and he correlated them, and he could see that they rose and sank, the numbers of fish returning in complete synchronicity, no matter what river he was studying, notwithstanding local effects like how industrialization might have completely killed the salmon in the Mersey, for example. But generally speaking, there was absolute synchronicity in the rises and the falls. So he speculated in the 1930s that the overarching thing affecting salmon numbers must be occurring at sea, which I thought was incredibly interesting. And also that the northeast stock, as he called it, had a more stable kind of stock market chart of rises and falls than the southwest, albeit the rises and falls still matched each other. One was much more stable than the other. And I've been doing some charts actually ahead of talking to show exactly the same thing, Scotland compared to England and Wales in terms of salmon numbers. So anyway, I was following that, and I was looking at reasons why this kind of different genetic race might have evolved. And I was looking also, because I'm really interested in geology and the history of chalk streams geologically, I was looking at glaciation and the phases of glaciation, and how glaciers have essentially come down over the European landmass multiple times during the existence of salmon, of Atlantic salmon as a species. So, the proto-salmon evolved 100-odd million years ago. It's a weird kind of fish. It was the chance encounter of two hybrid species, two hybrid smelt. It's a polyploid, which is polyploid, so it's got double the chromosomes of most animals and plants, makes it very adaptable. The Atlantic salmon and the brown trout are incredibly closely related. They probably split as distinct species about 2 million years ago. So you can say maybe the Atlantic salmon, I think this is right, has been around for about 2 million years. And during that time, over multiple times, ice has come down all the way through Norway, Finland, Sweden, Scotland, and most of England, down to a line that you could draw between, say, Bristol and Great Yarmouth. And so if you think about it, salmon have been driven out of that, what we see as the salmon homeland, because the country, the landmass became icebound. And salmon must have been driven further south. And you could probably say that, Spain might have been the equivalent of Scotland at those glacial maximums. And if you now think that there are native brown trout in Morocco on the African continent, they're indigenous, they must have got there when the world was a lot colder and got up into the Atlas Mountains. And they've managed to hang on in the Atlas Mountains because they're high enough and they don't have to be migratory. But salmon, which have to have that migratory phase, which probably once also swam the rivers of North Africa, mountainous areas anyway, they're no longer there. So salmon ebb and flow with these pulses of glaciation that take place over time spans of 100,000 years odd. But in all of that time, the ice never got further south, as I say, than that line. And so if you think about it, the chalk streams, in terms of their catchment, you have to imagine that the English Channel is now a valley. The ice has locked up a hell of a lot of water, and the North Atlantic doesn't start. And the coastline was somewhere between Brest and Spain. It was way, way further out. And there was a river running down the English Channel called the Channel River, which drained the Thames and the Seine and the rivers of Normandy and the rivers of Dorset and Hampshire. And they all went into this absolutely the largest chalk stream you've ever seen, the Channel River, which of course is underwater now. But at that time, those chalk streams of Normandy and also Wessex would have been probably the only viable freshwater habitat that salmon could occupy, because they're sort of spring-fed. And in fact, if you go to Iceland now, you can find spring-fed rivers on the edge of glaciers, and they're the only rivers that hold salmonids because the glacial meltwater rivers are too cold. So this idea that I came sort of, I thought, well, what? When a few years into, or I published the book, or about the same time, some research emerged based on genetic studies of chalk stream salmon that said that they were genetically, very distinct. There was very little mixture between the Atlantic salmon of the chalk streams and the Atlantic salmon of, say, Devon and Cornwall, sort of, which are really quite close to each other. I'm dying for them to see whether the chalk streams of England, whether those salmon are related to the French chalk stream salmon. Be really interesting. And I thought, well, that really fits with this idea that the chalk streams were the only viable habitat at those glacial maximums where the salmon could hold on. And so they've been there for all that time. And this would explain their genetic distinction, distinct from other, in a way, races of salmon, from the Exe or the Tin, or those rivers in Devon and Cornwall. So I think it's an amazing thought that, I don't know if it's provable, but it would certainly explain the genetic distinction that salmon have always been there since they've evolved. They've been occupying the chalk streams. And so I wrote this story about the way, because I thought, well, that would make them one of our longest resident vertebrate animals, and yet they are on the edge of extinction. And it's absolutely up to us to ensure that doesn't happen. But they're at 1 minute to midnight, and yet they've been there for 2 million years. And I think that's an incredible thought. It's humbling, but it's also a real stir to action, because we've somehow got to buck this trend of declining salmon and the way in which the planet is warming and they're being driven further north. But I think if chalk streams held on to salmon when it was very cold, I think they can also do it in a slightly warming world, because of course chalk streams come out of the ground at 10, 11 degrees centigrade. And maybe as some of those rain-fed rivers of the south coast become unviable for salmon, maybe chalk streams could still represent something of an arc. So that was my white rhino kind of call to arms, really, Jim.
It's a mind-blowing hypothesis. And for somebody who lives on the Itchen and is a big champion of the chalk stream salmon, it really gives it a romance, even more of a romance, if such a thing is possible, than its Scottish, Norwegian, Icelandic, South Coast cousins, if you like. So in a sense, what we're saying is chalk stream salmon, the chalk streams themselves were the Noah's Ark for this unique species, and they harbored and sheltered the Atlantic salmon through all these climactic, dramatic, huge shifts, these changes that have gone on over the millennia. So why now, if we're saying that the chalk stream is a constant because of the aquifers and because of all the reasons that make chalk streams unique, why now, as the temperature of that water is still, roughly speaking, we're saying similar to what it was 2 million years ago, why are the salmon struggling more now than they were then if they have used these chalk streams as strongholds?
Okay, so yeah, just qualifying. So the arc that I see the chalk streams forming was for English salmon in a way, in the sense that at the glacial maximums, I think that perhaps the chalk streams were able to hold a salmon, a functioning salmon population. There would of course been salmon down further south in Europe, in southern France, the Pyrenees, through Spain, and as I say, maybe even further south than that. And in terms of the temperature, of course, at the headwaters of those chalk streams, which are now the chalk streams, because of course, the Test and the Itchen would have been the headwaters of this amazing English Channel river. So perhaps the viable salmon part of them was sort of further downstream in the system. Maybe they did come up as far as what's now Southampton. Wouldn't have been anyone there back then. You did have sort of big temperature, huge temperature shifts between sort of summer and winter, and glacial meltwater and permafrost and all sorts of things. So the climatic conditions would have been massively different then to now. And I've sometimes speculated that if you go to Iceland and look across the kind of treeless landscape on the edge of the glaciers, that might have been what Hampshire and Dorset looked like 16,000 years ago. But as to why now, why they're suffering now, I think that with salmon, it's always a mistake to look for one cause for their demise. I think it's been one thing after another over a very, very long time period. I should have just given a nod to the research, by the way, the genetics. I mentioned it, but I didn't say that it emanated from Exeter University. That the genetics, the uniqueness of chalk stream salmon. So if anyone wants to look that up, that's a 2018 paper. But also there's a paper from a Dutch university, I think, a chap called Rob Lenders, I think, wrote a paper, which I dropped you a line about the impact of medieval watermills on salmon. And the estimation in that paper is that by the year, so this is particularly on the lowland salmon rivers of Europe, so not just chalk streams, but definitely including chalk streams. The estimate in that paper is that by 1900, salmon populations had crashed by 90% relative to the year 900 at the beginning of the watermill revolution. And the theory in that paper is that it's the watermills made an absolutely massive impact on salmon runs on rivers like the Thames and the Seine and the Rhine and the Test and the Itchen and the Frome and the Stour, etc. So that's one thing, and then moving forward in time, you had the Industrial Revolution, which filled our rivers with industrial toxins. You had the sort of Victorian blockages to migration that would have been created by really, really very, we think you've got a sewage crisis now. You only have to read some accounts of medieval Norwich to know what raw sewage was really like back in those times. And it was so bad that actually it created, you always think with salmon, it's all about barriers to migration. But the barriers to migration don't have to be physical barriers like mills, they can be, but they can also be toxic barriers made by sewage or chemicals, industrial pollution, etc. So it's one thing after another. And then you reach the 20th century, and we sort of look back at the year, as we did earlier in our chat, Jim, to the year 1900 as some kind of halcyon day, until you then think about the paper I've just mentioned, which estimates that the halcyon day was still only 10% of what it had been 1,000 years beforehand. And then all of the things across the 20th century, the slings and arrows we've chucked at this fish in the last 120 years, make everything else look, it's amazing they're still here, frankly. If you think about the way dredging the post-war dig for victory dredging of our rivers, I think, is one of the absolutely most significant impacts on salmon populations in chalk streams. But you also think of the fact that, to add insult to injury, and I think at the 1950s, we actually discovered where the poor fish were feeding at sea. And so they were fished to hell in the high seas for a number of decades before Ori Vigfusson managed to slow that down. So I think it's been one thing after another. And when I think about, but what's really worrying and puzzling is the last 20, 30 years has seen a real decline. So there's a really good data set on the River Frome, which there's I think running back to the 1970s, when
Salmon Labs,
the salmon runs on the Frome average between 2 to 3, maybe even 4,000 fish in exceptional years through the 1970s and 80s, and since then they've been bumping along at 1/3. There was a crash in the late 1980s. Early 1990s, and that is echoed. If you look at the salmon runs, that crash is echoed right across the British Isles, although they seem to have recovered a bit more in Scotland, and now they're declining again. But there does seem to be a precipitous decline in the last few years, and what explains that? I don't know, but it's profoundly worrying.
I guess if there's one chink of or a ray of hope that we can get from this accelerated demise, is that it is spurring people into action. People are realizing that this really is a serious situation now. You and I are working behind the scenes on something down here. When I say down here, on the Itchen and the Test and Itchen valleys, we're working on a project called Project White Hart, which, broadly speaking, it's an ambitious plan, as I think you'll agree, but it's a 20 to 25 year plan, which involves harvesting as much data, doing a huge audit on these rivers to find out just where and how salmon are being impacted, and then implementing a restoration plan. And it involves, or it needs to involve, should I say, all stakeholders. It's absolutely mandatory that unless everybody who has a vested interest in this river and beyond are involved and supporting this project, it's not going to work. And I think you're Mr. Chalkstream, as far as I'm concerned. I'm running along behind you, picking up your tidbits whenever I can. So to have you involved is a real honor and a blessing. But I think you'll agree with me when I say one of the huge impacts that these rivers are currently facing, and ergo the salmon, are pollution, are these invisible migration barriers to migration that you spoke of. Obviously, the mills. I mean, can we tear down mills in central Winchester to help these fish get up the Itchen? I don't know. We can certainly look at the bottom, but there are some big issues there. But the low hanging fruit, perhaps, is the pollution and the water companies, and maybe changes in behavior with agriculture, certainly industrial agriculture. You've worked on chalk streams as well in Norfolk. Are they suffering the same issues as we are down here? What are your thoughts on pollution?
Well, I think that, I would say be wary of separating mills from pollution, or let's just broaden it beyond mills. Impoundments. Things that interrupt the gradient of the stream are very, very integrally related to pollution. If you think about it, pollution is one of the big forms of pollution in chalk streams, and we definitely suffer from this big time in Norfolk, probably more than you do in Hampshire, although you definitely suffer from Hampshire, is sediment. Sediment runoff from the landscape, sediment runoff from roads, and a natural chalk stream, before we came along and occupied the landscape, chalk streams would have been incredibly stable systems, with very, very little sediment getting in from the wider landscape. They're spring fed. You would have had, you'd basically very, very clean rivers. bright gravel. We hadn't messed around with them. We hadn't diverted them. We hadn't taken all the bends out, and we hadn't interrupted their gradient. And there was hardly any sediment getting in. So they would have been incredible. And if you think about the modern landscape, we've added immensely to the number of pathways that water can travel from the landscape to the river and the ways in which that water can carry sediment. You just think about the road system in a winter downpour, especially with all the sort of large vehicles we drive nowadays, the size of tractors crushing up roadside verges. So there's been a lot of research into the origins of sediment in chalk streams, and a hell of a lot comes from roadside verges, but also from farmland and so on. And toxins, aid the nutrients that go on fields, the nutrients that get in from sewage, and then all of these worrying pollutants, some of which we know very little about, some of which we know more about. A lot of them are attached to the sediment. Now it gets into the river, and then it gets into a very, very heavily modified system. We've taken the steady slope gradient of a natural chalk stream and we've turned it into a staircase. In fact, I think it was Ruskin, who was a very, very early river conservationist, wrote beautifully about the lovely chalk stream, the River Wandle in London, and how bad it was. He talked about how we'd used mills to turn salmon rivers into a series of pike ponds, as he described it, I think was the phrase. So if you think about the function of these mills and these impoundments, these weirs, everything that interrupts the gradient, the way we dredge the rivers, and that's just forming a sediment trap. And so the sediment accumulates in the bed of the river, and every time it's disturbed, all of those toxins and nutrients get reanimated into the system. So you can't quite separate the two, because one makes the other worse. And that really, I think, is very, very significant. And I think it ought to be a significant consideration in the Project White Hart, because we've done a bit of restoration on the River Nar in Norfolk, and I could show you a bit where the physical habitat is in really good nick. There's good gradient. We've got the meanders back. It's full of, trees have fallen in and we've left them in, and the river's really complicated and it looks fabulous. And I could take you 300 yards and show you a bit that looks dreadful because it's stuck behind a weir and it's an old bit that's dredged and we can't fix it, perhaps because of some archaeological reason or whatever. And it's full of burreed. It's the same water and it's the same flow, but it's different physical habitat. So physical habitat has the effect of either greatly exaggerating the negative impacts of over abstraction or pollution. And also it could have the effect of ameliorating those impacts very significantly as well. And then the other thought is, of course, we mustn't separate abstraction from pollution, because when we abstract the flow from our chalk rivers, we reduce the amount of water there is to dilute the pollutants. So we're essentially creating a more concentrated form of the pollutant by abstracting the flow that's in the river. So all of these things are really interrelated. But to go to your question, I know you did some campaigning back in the winter when one of the sewage works was suffering terrible sort of high groundwater sewage ingress, and it was spilling into the river 24 hours a day, months on end. That's a real problem. Septic tanks is a problem. The raw sewage issues are a problem. Agricultural pollution is a problem. These things all add up.
Going back to your barriers to migration, physical barriers to migration, and I agree with you. I think it should be something that will hopefully come up in the audit with regards to Project White Hart, but it certainly needs very heavy focus.
Yeah.
Obviously, the answer is you pull these things down unless they are serving purpose to negate that. You pull them down. But what's the reality of that? I mean, what have you come across? Have you applied to remove weirs? I mean,
it's
in this day and age, the bureaucracy around government. How do we do it?
It's not easy at all, because Well, I think if it's performing no kind of socioeconomic function anymore, and some aren't. I know there are a handful of big barriers to migration on the Itchen, for example, and on the Test. Um, uh, but of course, a lot of them are part of beautiful mill houses, and the owners of these mill houses aren't necessarily going to want to see, everything changed around them. Having said that, there are ways you can build bypasses, so you can. What you don't do with a bypass is you don't necessarily relieve the gradient interruption that is necessitated by a mill. So just so the listeners can understand how this works, so they can form a picture in their minds. If you've got a river flowing naturally down the middle of a valley on a steady slope, that's how rivers evolve. You can't necessarily put a mill on that river. You can if it's a very, very steep river and it's very, very fast flowing. And in the north of England, where rivers are tended to be like that, you can plonk the mill, or they used to, the Norse mill it was called, bang in the middle of the stream with a wheel that actually turned in the water. And so it was like a vertical mill shaft, and that turned the grinding stone. But on lowland rivers, you don't have the steepness in the valley slope to do that. So you've got to create what's called a head of water. You've actually got to divert the river to the edge of the floodplain and run it along a flat line for however far it takes until you've created about 2 meters of drop between the river that you've suspended on the edge of the floodplain and the natural low point in the valley. And when you've got about 2 meters of drop, you've then got enough drop to put a mill on it. Now, the maths is quite easy. If the river gradient is 1 in 1,000, that's quite low for a chalk stream, but let's say it makes the maths easier, and you want to create a 2 meter drop, you've got to create a 2 kilometer diversion in order to build up that 2 meter head differential. Most of the time they weren't quite 2 kilometers, but most mill races running, or mill leats running down to the mills, are at least 500 meters long, if not longer, because it took that much time to get the head of water. So basically every mill sits on a diversion from the natural course of the river. The natural course of the river tended to be kept as a flood relief channel, but as the mills have fallen into disuse, those old natural courses, the flood relief channels, have become silted up. They've been ploughed over. They've been lost. I spent a lot of my time trying to find them, and so what we're left with is a legacy of a sort of a chalk stream that's basically in the wrong place. So you can, going back to your question, you can put diversions around them. You can put like channels to help the salmon ascend the river. And that can do a lot to alleviate barriers to migration, but it doesn't necessarily address the way in which the mill negatively impacts the gradient of the river itself. And I remember that first job I alluded to, 1987, when I started to work at Camford, and there was actually a big run of salmon up the Stour that winter. There's a salmon ladder at the weir pool there, and the salmon spent 2 weeks trying in vain to get under the sluice gate, but the flow from it was so powerful that they'd jump onto the apron of concrete, paddle like crazy, get within about 5 meters of the sluice gate, and then get flung back into the pool at high speed. And they totally exhausted themselves trying to get under this weir gate. And only when the flows in the river receded enough to the point where the weir gate could be closed did the salmon switch their attention to the salmon ladder and actually get upstream. So one mill on a little chalk stream in Norfolk, where the mill owner welcomed the idea of lifting the mill boards and just watching his mill leat drain and become, upstream of his mill house, the most beautiful meandering channel that just evolved in the old mill leat. And that's on the River Glaven. And it's a fantastic example, which I would show to any mill owner, of how they could turn the sort of slightly duck-polluted mill leat upstream of their house into a beautiful, swift-flowing stream by lifting the boards. So it's not impossible, and maybe some mill owners would think about it.
That would be a thing, wouldn't it, if we could get that movement going? If there are any listeners that are interested in that, please do get in touch and we'll connect you with Charles to give you the relevant information. So going back to the salmon, the chalk stream salmon,
Yeah.
we know that there are big issues out at sea. We know that the numbers of returning salmon are drastically low. On my local river, on the Itchen, they are literally in their hundreds, low hundreds, and consistently getting lower. It's unsustainable, as is the test. You mentioned the Froome. The numbers are dropping and should be much higher than they are. Now, you and I believe that a way to mitigate this, or certainly to potentially stem the bleed, is to make these rivers into salmon factories, is to create a habitat that gives the returning spawning salmon the best chance to spawn healthy eggs, and for the juvenile salmon, for the parr and the smolt, to grow into big, fat teenagers before we send them off out into the big bad world of the sea. Project White Hart, bringing it back to that, plans to do that. Is that would be fair to say? What we want to do is find out how we can restore these rivers and give these fish the best chance of spawning. And can I just add, for people that are listening that perhaps think this is a very salmon-centric project, well, yes, it is. But the reason why it's so championed and we're looking for such wide support is because, of course, if the salmon are thriving in any river, let alone the chalk streams, it's my belief, and it's commonly held belief, they need cold, clean water, the river will be in a healthier state than it certainly is at the moment. It creates a great ecosystem, great habitat for all the other flora, fauna, and living creatures to thrive. So, Project White Hart, 5 years' time, up to 5 years' time, should we say, we figure out where the real pinch points are, what the real pressures are for returning salmon. You're perhaps a little ahead of the curve compared to myself, and certainly I would imagine a lot of the listeners. What sort of thing will we be looking at as solutions when it comes to chalk stream restoration projects?
Yeah, this is a lot will come out of the research phase, I think, but there's a lot we know already in terms of creating really good habitat. And this is something I think where the test and Itchen is going to be challenged, because traditional management of the test and Itchen, they're probably the more keepered rivers of all our chalk streams. And those are for sort of economic, social reasons to do with the sort of the storied, famous fisheries and the way they've been traditionally managed for many, many decades. I think that there's perhaps a case for suggesting sort of a lighter touch, allowing, when trees fall, trees and chalk streams are, when a tree falls in, maybe leave it in. It complicates the flow. It creates myriad niches of habitat. They're one of the only ways in which chalk streams can get more aggregate into the system. If a tree falls in, it'll blow a hole in the river. You'll get a big band of gravel thrown out downstream of it. I could show you dozens of photographs of this taking place in nature. Those mounds of gravel that you get below a fallen tree form magnificent areas for fish to spawn on. So I think that there's probably some work to be done in terms of sort of wilding the rivers up a little bit, making them a bit messier and a bit with lots more habitat niches. A difficult one, this, but I'd ask a question about the stocking levels, especially on the lower rivers, because now that we have to stock with triploids, which overwinter rather well, I wonder how many young salmon parr they might be predating on. So there's a bit of a question there. I think that the test and Itchen, in a way, were quite fortunate during the dredging era to not get too heavily dredged, but there was quite a lot of dredging nevertheless on the test and Itchen, which has effectively removed the gravel beds from large parts of the river. So I've done a lot of work on the Norfolk streams, which are much smaller. They're the size of one of your tributaries, but restoring gravel, restoring meanders where they've been lost, all that kind of thing. And I've seen amazing results in terms of invertebrates, wild fish recruitment, that kind of thing. So yeah, I think your phrase "salmon factories" is really good. I think what we're sort of thinking of there is is just making these rivers as fantastic as they can be a nursery for the returning salmon. Yeah, there's stuff out at sea which we can't do anything about. For every returning fish, can we say that in 20 years' time, for every returning fish, Project White Hart will have increased the numbers of young par relative to that returning fish that go to sea, and then and increase their size. Basically, if you have more of these par going to sea, and you make them fatter, and fatter is all about habitat, that is when you give them their best start as they head out to sea. If they're strong and they're slightly larger, they have a much higher survival rate, and it's all about maths. Now we've got, the return rate is something, I think it's about 3 or 4%. I think Ken in his great interview with you before Christmas was talking about about 3 or 4%. It used to be about 13 or 14%. The only thing you can do in the face of that is go, right, well, if it's now 4% of, 4 in 100 coming back as opposed to 14 in 100, you need to send 300 to sea in order to get 14 back. So it's like got to put more fish out to sea. That's where I think Project White Hart has got some low-hanging fruit, is going for it in terms of creating really amazing habitat where you can. We know what to do. We know it's about putting the bends back, putting the gradient, putting the gravel back, putting the complexity back, limiting the sediment inputs, all of which is, it's doable. We know how to do it. It's just a question of doing it.
You touched upon testing the itch, and in particular, there's big fishery industry down here. It's a mecca for upstream dry fly fishing. It was ever thus, or certainly since the days of Halford and his peers. And I think, to maybe calm the horses a little bit, I don't think Project White Hart will, whilst it will certainly take a close look at the stocking nature of the brown trout that are put in this river, and as you quite rightly say, and just how much they're impacting the juvenile salmon. I think, for my money, what we're asking for, or what might come of this, is a slight shift in how we fish, in a change of attitude, which is probably overdue. And you talk about scruffing up the rivers, maybe not putting them to bed at winter, this term, putting them to bed, the manicuring of the banks and the cutting back. We want things a little wilder, a little scruffier. Now, there's certainly still a place for anglers in that environment. As far as I'm concerned, you and I are both enjoy fishing for wild brown trout on these wilder rivers. I think it's just a case of a slight shift in education with anglers, certainly the younger anglers that are coming up, which are so vital to the future of these chalk streams and to angling and to wild fish in general and to the salmon. My hope is, and the ones that I've spoken to and engaged with are certainly very open-minded when it comes to perhaps changing how they might approach angling for brown trout on the test and the Itchen, for the sake of example. So it feels like we're at a corner here, and it's not just about restoration, and it's not just about turning these rivers into salmon factories. It's about a re-education in angling, especially on these rivers, my local rivers, who rely so much on fisheries as an industry.
Yeah, I completely agree. I don't think one would ever be looking to compel anything. But I think back to, again, we restocked the how things have changed. Even in the last 30 years, we restocked the Stour with grayling from the River Test in the late 1980s and 1990s, early 1990s, because back then the grayling were regarded as such vermin on a trout beat that they were sort of electro-fished and got rid of. And I said to, I think it was the National Rivers Authority back then, well, bring them over to the Stour, we'll pop them in there. And so the Stour got repopulated with test grayling. I don't know how many people know that, but they're doing very well. So I think things have changed greatly. There are beats on and estates on both the test. Well, the Upper Itchen has always been pretty predominantly wild fishing, but there are estates and beats on both rivers that are getting into the concept of not necessarily wild only, but of wilder fishing, and some wild only. I know National Trust and Mottisfont is moving in that direction. And the other thing I think is worth thinking about, again, it's probably a generational thing and over time, is that the lower ends of these rivers are magnificent mixed fisheries, where you can catch other species. I've caught amazing pike and perch and chub, some beautiful, beautiful fish in the lower reaches. And actually, valuing them in that sense, I think is really part of the key on that. So I think that it's going to happen. I think it's a generational thing to a degree, and I think that it's a taste thing. I think anglers now coming through, young anglers are much more interested in the sort of, can I put it like, the real deal. And going back to the scruffing up, whenever I fish some pretty untidy bits of chalk streams in Dorset and Norfolk, where it's real jungle warfare, but whenever I spot a 3.5 pound wild brownie sipping mayflies, it's under some completely impenetrable thicket of a tree. And, and when I'm lucky, I'll get a fly in there. Or if I'm really lucky, it's dropped back and it's in the open and I can get a fly. But I know that it's there because the cover is there.
And I think we need to put the fish first and perhaps the anglers second. You touched upon stocking the Stour with grayling from the test. If we are to reach the upper plains of bigger numbers of returning chalk stream salmon, what are your views? Or let me rephrase that, actually. If both of us get what we want and these chalk streams, including the ones all the way up in Norfolk, all the way down through Kent and up in Yorkshire and down through Wessex, become these Noah's Arks for the chalk stream salmon, and we want to repropagate them and encourage the salmon to use them because we're worried that the traditional spate rivers perhaps become too warm for habitats. How are we going to get the salmon in there?
Yeah, quite. Well, that's a really good question. I think it's a bit iconoclastic to suggest it, but I think we could think about, we've got to build a habitat first. I would love to see salmon running the East Anglian chalk streams again. And the River Stiffkey, the River Nar, I don't see why we couldn't do that. We've either got to wait for a fish from the Yorkshire-esque to take a wrong turn. We'd probably need several in a row to take a wrong turn. We could be waiting a long time.
Lots of rogue fish.
Well, they do take wrong turns every so often. I mean, salmon not so often sea trout, but they do, and that's how they repopulate places. But we're talking about geological timescales there, not impatient human timescales. So I think we probably need to embrace the slightly heretical idea of restocking. But I think the thing with stocking, it's very controversial. The scientific community aren't necessarily that mad on it, and for good reasons, I suspect. You're probably mucking about with genetic diversity, with survival of the fittest, and all sorts of other concepts like that. But it has been done, and there might be ways of doing it that sort of, to a degree, get around those issues. And where you've got an existing salmon population, however, which you have in the Test and the Itchen, the Avon and the Froome and the Stour and a few in the Piddle, probably the first port of call there is to just try and maximize the survival and spawning escapement of the fish that you've got. But where there aren't any, I kind of think what's to lose? Point is, though, you've got to build the habitat. You've got to build the habitat that they can take advantage of. And then having done so, I have a sort of slightly romantic idea that of the River Stiffkey and Nar in Norfolk, when we put all the wiggles back and we got the river rollicking along on a downhill gradient the whole way, and it's full of trees and wildness, we can then think about saying, hey, this is pretty funky juvenile salmon habitat, so let's give them a helping hand. I hope that would be an idea people would embrace, and it would be like, well, what have we got to lose? And it might work.
Well, I think that's what Ken Whelan was alluding to as well, wasn't he? In the conversation we had with him, is the time is if the rivers are healthy enough to produce a habitat for spawning fish and for the juveniles, let's get to work, because we're at that point now.
Yeah.
Maybe there's an argument, just as he was talking about in Ireland and Scotland, there's an argument in England to say, okay, the chalk streams of Norfolk, now that they're up to speed, up to scratch, let's make them salmon conservation rivers. Let's take out angling altogether, put a moratorium on angling, and let's make this a salmon-centric conservation river. And any other chalk streams or any other rivers, indeed, that are home to the salmon, we should maybe looking at that as a theory.
Yeah, I don't think we'd be looking to angle for salmon in these. This is a far future vision. But were it to happen, and you had a couple of hundred fish, let's say, running some future river certificate, I don't think we'd be chasing them with a rod and line. It would just be fantastic to have them there. But your Project White Hart could play a really significant role, because it's happening right here, right now, is in sort of showing, let's see what it can do in terms of, the degree to which habitat can make a difference, in which salmon, they exist right now. I think it's going to be really, really interesting. I think it really is a challenge, because, as I say, that there's a headwind out at sea, which in the end might defeat us. But we shouldn't, we shouldn't go down without a fight in our efforts to save this iconic, oldest, native of these islands, amazing animal. I just think, it's a great project, and hope it works.
Well, me too. You and I both, and we'll both be there at the coalface watching with bated breath. But I think you're right. It's time to step up the fight. I'm just going to remind the audience of The Accidental Angler, which I was a huge fan of, which saw Charles traveling the world with his fishing rod in his backpack, catching whatever species was available to him in whatever environment he happened to land in and follow. Do you still get much chance to fish? You're in New Zealand now. I'm assuming the answer to that is yes. I'm hoping the answer to that is yes.
Yeah, well, if it would stop raining, that would be great. Yeah. I love New Zealand for all sorts of reasons. Not least that in parts of New Zealand there are spring-fed rivers that I study with a fly rod in my hand, but I also study them, curiously, to see what a kind of, wild river looks like. We've sort of lost that idea because we've changed our rivers so much. So yeah, I do. I love fishing in New Zealand. I fish the spring creeks here. I fish the chalk streams back home. I fish in Derbyshire on the Wye, which is a limestone river. You're getting the theme. I do like spring-fed rivers. A little volcanic spring-fed river in Iceland I go to every now and again. And it's mostly, I must admit, if you said to me right now, you can only fish for brown trout with a dry fly from here on out, yeah, I wouldn't mind that much. But I do love other fish as well. So I do love salmon, obviously. Pike, I can never tire of that take when a pike hits the fly or the spinner. The other fish I've certainly addicted to for a while with bonefish out in the Bahamas. So, and then of course things like, which I very rarely fish for, but occasionally I actually quite enjoy fishing for chub with a dry fly. Daddy long legs in September can be pretty good fun. So I get my fair share in, I have to admit.
Is this a theory or is this fact? You probably be able to help me with this. The brown trout in New Zealand that I'm sure, when the rain stops, you'll be out fishing for on those spring rivers, were put there by an Englishman. And that was off the back of trying to propagate those rivers with Atlantic salmon.
Yeah.
Which part of that story falls apart? Fill me in, because it's fascinating. The empire fish, as I call it.
Yeah, no, you're correct, except it wasn't an Englishman. It was an Australian farmer, or Tasmanian farmer, actually. Gentleman farmer, I should say, called James Yule. He did it. He cracked the nut, so to speak, of how to do it in 1864. And I know his great-great-grandson, Michael, who's a wonderful fisherman and a wonderful gentleman. And he's in his 90s, I think, or certainly late 80s, 90s. I'm hoping to see him and go fishing with him in a few weeks' time. Yeah, they tried for years and years and years in the mid 19th century to get salmon to Tasmania. The trout were not even on the menu of transportation. If you think about it back then, it's a very different world. Humans had a very different approach to the propagation of species around the place, and there were things called acclimatization societies, which took it upon themselves to import to the New World lots, and as it was called, wasn't the New World, of course, to its indigenous inhabitants, but it was to the Europeans. So they transported anything you could think of: goats, pheasants, skylarks, blackbirds, rabbits. No one thanked us for the rabbits. But there was this idea of getting salmon out there. Well, it's a lot easier to take a goat on a boat than it is to take a salmon, and the boat was the only way. So how did they do it, And they tried all sorts of bonkers techniques. The very first attempt was to put young salmon in a barrel of fresh water on the deck of the ship. But of course, they all parboiled by the time it reached the Canary Islands, I think. And then they constructed onboard ice houses and flowing streams and da-da-da-da-da. And it's all the voyage after voyage ended in failure. And James Yule, very practical man, worked out that all he had to do was get some pine boxes, fill them with moss and eyed over, and put them in an ice house on the floor under about 10 feet of blocks of ice. And as long as there was still ice melting and the ice water was trickling over the top of the eggs, they would remain viable. And he proved it in an ice house in London, and then he proved it on board a boat. And they took salmon to Tasmania, and the trout were an afterthought. So what happened is James Yule, there was a great freeze. He had his boat. He didn't have any eggs. He put a letter in the Times appealing to the fishery owners up and down the United Kingdom to supply him with salmon eggs so that he could finally get, as he described it, this noble fish to Australia. And the next, 2 days later, carts arrived in Southampton from all over the place with consignments of salmon eggs. And a gift, in amongst all of this, was a gift of 3,000 trout eggs from 3 different chalk streams. And James Yule jolly nearly threw them into Southampton Harbour, as he said in his diary, but he didn't in the end. He decided to put them on board. They went to Tasmania. The salmon hatched. The trout hatched. The salmon, after 2 years, disappeared to sea, and no one ever saw them ever again because they didn't know where they were. They were in the southern hemisphere. They didn't have a North Pole to navigate by, etc., etc. The trout, however, well, the rest is history, because the trout just thought, wow, look at this.
And is that the same for New Zealand?
Yeah, so the New Zealand fish effectively came from Tasmania over to the west coast of New Zealand.
Right.
And there were lots and lots of shipments of trout subsequent to that, but that first one was the one which the sort of ancestry of most of the southern hemisphere, also the Antipodean fish, come from. I believe. I think there were shipments from Loch Leven and various other places that followed. So there's probably a bit of that mixed in. So yeah, that's how they're here. They're not native.
Isn't that fascinating? And it was all because of the salmon.
Yeah, exactly. It was all because of the salmon, and it wasn't really even a salmon fishery that they were after. It was sort of salmon as a resource, as an industry, and a fishery, not a pleasure fishery, but a resource fishery. And actually, there are salmon here, but they're all Pacific. And for some reason, Pacific salmon did manage to kind of. There are wild, inverted commas, runs of Pacific salmon in. Don't know about Tasmania, but definitely New Zealand. They do work down, at the wrong end of the planet. But the Atlantic salmon were just like, yeah, no, thanks very much.
Charles, we're going to finish with 3 questions that we always ask our guests. Number 1. If you had £1 billion to help save the wild salmon, how would you spend it?
Yeah, so 1 billion's quite a chunk of change. I think going to the Project White Hart idea, I would take a river. But knowing you've got Project White Hart going, Jim, already on the Test and Itchen, I would choose a river like the Froome, which I'm very passionate about, having lived so long in Dorset. And I think that I would spend that 1 billion just moving heaven and earth to make that river as amazing as it could be. The Froome was pretty badly dredged, so there's a lot of gravel to put back. There's a lot of meanders to put back. There's a lot of maize farming to deal with, and big sediment issues in the upper river. But I think £1 billion would be really, really interesting, because you could, to say nothing of the sort of nutrient load going into Poole Harbour that you could do something about as well at the same time. You know, embracing a bit of Ori Vigfuson's green capitalism, as he called it, when he encouraged the high seas salmon fishermen to put down their nets. Yeah, could you do that with some of the, you know, the sort of farmland around the rivers? So that would go a long way, I think, and just see what you could do to make the river as fecund as possible when it comes to wild salmonids. And I think it would be pretty amazing what you could do actually with that.
I think £1 billion would create some sort of fluvial utopia on the Froome.
Exactly.
It would be quite something.
Yeah. So if Elon Musk is listening, I've got a jolly good way to spend a tiny fraction of his money.
He's a big fan of the show, I'm told. So let's hope it gets to him. If you had no money, what would you do to help save the wild salmon?
Well, I'd carry on using the pen as a weapon. I think, words, I write, and I write about the fishing and the fish that I'm passionate about. So I'd do more. I'd just carry on doing that, do more of that, and try and use writing to make a difference.
Great. And I'm going to put in a request on that front. I'm sure somewhere in you is a book just on salmon. Knowing what you know, and especially the recent research you've done over the last 5-10 years, that needs to be written down, because I think it would sell like hotcakes. I'd certainly buy 10 copies straight away.
It's a deal.
It's your last day on Earth.
Gosh.
And you've got to spend it fishing.
Yeah.
Where would that be, and who would it be with?
Do you know, it's sort of funnily enough, I've sort of thought about that a few times. I even started a piece about it, and I was actually writing about a spring creek in New Zealand. And that there's one particular spring creek in New Zealand. It might not be my final answer to this. I might say, because there are so many amazing places.
That's fine.
I've got to pick one. Well, I'll just tell you, there is this spring creek in Southland of New Zealand, which flows over. It's quite short, and it flows over some just sort of cattle meadows. It's got the biggest fish in it, and they rise every day at 3:00, just like clockwork. And they're really, really, really hard to catch, but they're not impossible. So I think that on this perfect day, I would probably be there, and I have lots of fishing friends as well. So I could name Simon Kane, Ronnie Butler, Patrick Lloyd, Nick Zoll, Mark Bale, lots and lots of friends. I'll give them all of it, but I think I'd probably have to spend it with my wife, who on this day, because it'd be my last day, would not be sort of, she'd be delighted to be accompanying me for a day's fishing. She might even deign to cast herself occasionally. When I'm obsessing over a fish that won't take my fly, she would sit down gently beside me on the riverbank, read a book, and occasionally make admiring remarks about my casting. And what's very annoying about it, she's incredibly reluctant to go fishing. She buys the fishing license and barely uses it. But when she does, she always catches the biggest fish. I try to keep it under limits.
Well, it was ever thus, I think, and there are all sorts of weird and wonderful theories as to why that might be. Charles, thank you so much, Charles Rangeley-Wilson. That has been a fantastic conversation. Just very quickly, if people want to learn more about your work with the chalk streams, where can they go to learn?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, well, I have a website, which is www.chalkstreams.org, all as one word. And I tend to post what's going on in my world on that. Not as often as I'd like to, because it's often a bit busy. And then I have an Instagram account, which is, I think, the same the same. It's at chalkstreams.org, I think. But also flagging up. So I chair the CABA Chalkstream Restoration Group. Alison Matthews is the manager of the program. And there is a CABA, if you Google CABA Chalkstream Restoration Strategy, for example, you'll find right top of the list the CABA page, which is sort of looking at all of the stuff that's going on in terms of the chalkstream work on a sort of, national level. So that's all the rivers, including some pretty down at heel or beleaguered, let's say, streams around London, which are under, serious pressure.
And I highly recommend listeners go and visit those pages, because the work that Charles and his peers are doing is really pioneering in saving and restoring these gems of rivers, these unique British, what are we calling them? I think David Attenborough called them rainforests of the UK, didn't he? Mm. They're so important to us and to Northern Europe, and so rare that we need to look after them. And if anybody wants to learn more about Project White Hart, the salmon restoration project that Charles and myself are involved in on the Test and the Itchen, at the time of recording, there isn't a website, but I'm sure by the time this goes out, there will be. So if you Google Project White Hart, you'll be pointed in the right direction on that one. Charles Rangeley-Wilson, thank you very much for giving us your time over there in New Zealand. It's been a real deep dive. It's been an edutainment, as the phrase is coined nowadays. It's education and entertainment spliced together, and you are that. To listen to you talk so passionately and so learnedly about chalk streams, about salmon, about wild fish in general is a real honor for myself, and I'm sure for the listeners too. Charles, thank you so much.
Very kind words. Thank you, Jim. It's been great fun as ever, and thanks a million.
Since recording this episode, Project White Hart has now set sail, and we've quickly discovered that radical action is urgently needed if we're to save this species. We will be updating you in detail on progress of this very personal project of mine in Season 3. But until then, head to projectwhiteheart.com or find us on socials to find out more. On Season 2's final episode of The Last Salmon, Alex Taylor, the CEO of Cox Enterprises, one of America's largest private companies, on his maximum efforts to save the Atlantic salmon. Listen and follow The Last Salmon on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and remember to keep in the fight for our salmon. The Last Salmon Season 2 is supported by the Missing Salmon Alliance.